Good morning. My name is Marwan Maashar. I'm the Vice President at Carnegie for Studies. And I want to welcome you all to the Syria Conference. Before we start, I want to offer our deepest condolences to the Syrian people for the horrific massacre that took place 2 days ago. And I would like to ask all of you to observe a moment of silence in honor of the dead. Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. This Syria conference, to which I have the pleasure and privilege to welcome you all, marks the entry of this bloody and almost unextractable conflict into its 7th year. The appraisal is appalling. More than 500,000 dead, among which more than 70% are civilians. Probably 3 to 4 times that figure are deeply wounded and handicapped. More than 150,000 have disappeared, are missing, or captive for political reasons. 11 million, half of Syria, are internally or externally displaced. An economy that has shrunk by 65% since the start of the war, and a GDP brought back to the level of the 1980s. International financial organizations estimate the minimal figure to set back Syria's structure to the point it reached at the eve of this period at around $180 billion. I can go on, and we will probably go through these dark aspects all along this day. But the situation is more dramatic than even that. This last 6th year of conflict in Syria was declared by UNICEF as the worst one for children. And indeed, in this long litany of horrors, the latest chemical attack on sleeping children in Khan Sheikhoun in the province of Idlib shows us once more what the regime will go to stay in power. Over the last 6 years, the Syrian conflict has swallowed hundreds of hours of international meetings and conferences. It has consumed 3 high-level and experienced UN special envoys without any tangible results so far. And it has exhausted and discouraged a large set of regional and international actors. More gravely, it has brought Syrians themselves to the point of extreme desperation and despair. Is there still a solution possible for this country? Would its continuous dismemberment ultimately leave intact the regional architecture surrounding it? And more basically, what will become of all the lost Syrian bodies and souls that this tragedy has resulted in? What has started by mid-March 2011 as a peaceful, mainly reformist movement of protest and revolt has quickly turned out into one of the ugliest butcheries in the nascent history of this 21st century. We can delve at length as to the reasons that went wrong and why, while Tunisia was taking the road to a bumpy but promising transition, why Syria was spiraling into a war that has today become the generator of many other conflicts and scenarios. This conference will attempt to look at these issues closely and attempt to answer some of the questions I raised. There is first the Syrian component as such, the one that triggered all of this. We have a regime, one of the most ruthless and brutal in an already fierce Middle East, that chose since day one the option of survival against all odds and against all pressures, resorting without any hesitation to the most extreme forms of collective intimidation and punishment. We have an opposition that was not organized the day before March 2011 and that had to cope quickly with international indifference and abandonment, with upscaled violent repression, but also with its disparate composition and nature, as well as with its nascent experiment in politics. We have a society that had to quickly organize and mobilize out of almost nothing to address the most basic needs of local population in terms of sheltering, schooling, health caring, and also hope keeping. And mushrooming on the ground, we have a myriad of fighting factions and rebel brigades and battalions whose mere numbers, contours, orientation, and ultimate affiliation is today one of the most difficult challenges to any experienced analyst in the world to understand and decrypt. With such a reality, is a Syrian solution to Syria still possible? Is Syria as such still possible? And under which conditions? This is what the second panel of this conference will examine through the eyes of Syrians. Moreover, the Syrian conflict today is not merely an internal one, and its crisis became one of the most entangled and interpenetrated with regional and international players. This is the curse of location, and Syria was at the crossroads of too many conflicts. The Arab-Israeli one, of course, but many latent Arab ones between pro-Western moderates and hardliners, and amongst these as well. It was in the middle of the crosshair between an affirmative and rising Turkey and its Arab foes, as well as in the middle of a Cold War between Arab Gulf states and Iran. And this is the curse of timing as well. Syria happened after Libya and its chaotic descent, after Russia's wake up and desire to stop its decline in regional affairs, and at a moment where the American system was eager to move away from the swamps of the region, and at a time when the West was trying to seek new directions with rising actors, Iran to mention but one. In the middle of all this, is any solution anymore a Syrian one? Isn't Syria today a hellish miniature of a world order in flux? And if so, will an international grand game type of solution be enough to extinguish Syrian fires and accumulated hatreds? This is the focus of the first panel. Because ultimately, and even though Syria's crisis is today the theater of a titanic struggle between all, it will be, once the dust settles, the land and homes of Syrians, individuals of all shades and allegiances, of all classes and segments, of all regions and sects, and who will have with enormous pain and difficulty to live again and live hopefully together. If one of the first victims of wars is truth, usually another main one are innocent people, civilians, human beings. The humanitarian aspect of Syria's war is probably the most heartbreaking since the end of World War II, with its cohorts of displaced people, refugees, destruction, and atomization of the social fabric. This is not only a matter of suffering alleviation, as important and drastically urgent it may be, but it is also a matter of future collective security for all, in the region and in the world. Europe and the West are already being reshaped by the flows of migrants. Neighboring countries are seeing their sociological DNA deeply altered by the refugee phenomenon and its many fallbacks. And while conflicts are the cause of humanitarian disasters, badly addressed humanitarian problems will in turn undoubtedly be the cause of new wars and conflicts. How do we approach this disaster? How do we assign figures to the gigantic human, social, and economic destruction? Is something to be expected from the international community in terms of economic and financial duress? Can these aspects be decoupled from the political trajectory that is to that day far from reaching an end? These are the questions that the third panel will touch upon. Ladies and gentlemen, we convene around Syria once again, of course, with a sad outlook and with a thought of sorrow for the people who are at this very moment being killed under the fire of shelling, seeking a piece of bread in the rubbles to feed their family, or looking for a sheltering torn tent on the hills of Lebanon or in the desert of Jordan to save their loved ones. But we also meet with our analytical will and tools, at least because this is the nature of our activity, with the prospect that the conflict itself has maybe started to consume itself, and with the hope of finding a glimmer of light at the long of this long tunnel. This conference has been hard to assemble, partly because of that, because of the many unknowns, and because sometimes in this town there is a kind of Syria fatigue. We hope this day long of discussions and debates will help us emerge from here with a more optimistic outlook. I want to thank the Asfari Foundation for making this conference possible. I want to thank two of our staff, Joe Bahout and John Pocari, who did a great job in organizing this conference. And I hope that you all will have a very fruitful day of discussion. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here in this very dark moment and a very gray day also, which is maybe a coincidence. I'm happy, and we are all happy, of course, on behalf of Carnegie, to welcome you today to discuss this very untractable situation that Dr. Moashir has just described. As he also said, this first panel will try to address, or mainly address, the international and regional ramifications of the Syrian crisis. Of course, the many levels are intertwined: the internal one, the domestic internal one, the economic one, the humanitarian one, and of course, the international one. In this panel, we'll try to focus on the external dimension. Of course, this is one of the moments where, with what happened 2 days ago and yesterday's statements by the Trump administration, we're at the moment probably where the international dimension is again on the forefront. We'll try in this panel, of course, we will, of course, integrate this last episode, this last sequence, the chemical attack, and what could happen. But I would also like to keep a kind of distance from that event in order to keep the perspective more global. Of course, we'll integrate what's happening today, and we'll try to put it in a larger and wider framework. To do that, we could have assembled a much larger panel, because the ramifications of Syria are really international. We could have had a European perspective, we could have had a Gulfi perspective, an Arab perspective, a Chinese perspective, but we had to make choices. So on this panel, we will have 4 very distinguished speakers. Without any order of priority, of course, I would say that more or less the American perspective will be presented by our dear friend Frederick Hoff, who's the director of the Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council and a long-time practitioner of Syria because he was a special envoy to Syria for a while. Then the Russian perspective, of course, although he's never been an official, although you were a diplomat for a while, Nikolai Kozanov, who is today the Interpol program professor at St. Petersburg University. And just for a notice, Nikolai was based as a diplomat in Tehran a few years ago, so he has an experience of something very touchy, by the way, which we will talk about, the Iranian-Russian relation. Then we have Ambassador Mousavian, who has been an Iranian official for a while. He was an ambassador to Germany, I think, and who is now, he has also played a crucial part and role in the nuclear negotiation at some points, and today he is a visiting scholar at Princeton University. Last but of course not least, a good friend also, Ghalib Daley, who is a Turkish, who has good outreach to, I think, the Turkish decision-making process, and he is the director of the Sharq Forum in Istanbul. Without further ado, the way I will organize this panel is to address our panelists, each one of our panelists, a question for a quick round of, let's say, perspective on the Syrian crisis, and then a second one. And then we'll have, I hope, a fluid and open discussion. Let me start by you, Fred, if you allow. I mean, regardless of what happened yesterday and before yesterday, of course, you will say a word about that. But the big question that we all have in mind for the last 3 months is, to what extent the Trump administration policy on Syria is or will be a real departure compared to the one that was in place under the Obama administration. And in that respect, what do you do of these latest statements by President Trump yesterday? And would it be a game changer, one of these many game changers that were proven, in fact, illusory all along the Syrian crisis?
Okay, well, good morning to all. Joe, thanks to you, Marwan, the Asfri Foundation for convening this. To my Syrian colleagues and friends, my deepest condolences over what's happened, and please also accept my sense of sincere regret over the failure of the West over the past 6 years to offer really anything meaningful in protection, in the sense of civilian protection in the Assad side of Syria. Joe, I think, frankly, I think the jury is still out. Notwithstanding the words of the president yesterday, notwithstanding the words of the United Nations ambassador Haley, the jury is still out as to whether or not we're at a true policy turning point. The president's words and those of the UN ambassador struck me as very heartfelt, very direct, but how this translates into actual policy is still not known. And I mean, in that sense, rather than having me sit here pontificating, we all would have been better off, perhaps, if there were an actual serving U.S. official up here to explain all of this. But I think the fact of the matter right now is that there may be no one short of the commander-in-chief himself who would actually be in a position to do that, to explain what the actual policy is, what the strategy is. My sense is that President Trump's top priority in Syria will continue to be the military defeat of Daesh, the so-called Islamic State. But any inclination he may have had to work with the Assad regime to that end is now dead. I cannot imagine anything more dead than that proposition and that possibility. There will be no collaboration with the Assad regime. I suspect that the president now sees very clearly, if he did not before, the connection between Assad's strategy of mass homicide and the ability of other violent extremists to recruit, to live long, and to prosper. But strong words aside from the president and from Ambassador Haley, the jury's still out. The chemical attack of 2 days ago presents President Trump and his administration with a very clear choice. React forcefully, perhaps including military strikes, or adopt the action-free, rhetoric-rich policy of his predecessor. That choice strikes me, in the wake of the president's words yesterday, as very, very stark, very clear. Assad's chemical attack, in my view, reflects his sense of total and absolute impunity. Recent administration statements to the effect that the fate of Assad himself is not a central concern may have, I emphasize, may have fed that sense of impunity. Assad may have concluded that the Obama administration's blind eye to civilian protection in Syria had continued seamlessly into the Trump administration. Still, in my view, it is not fair to blame newly minted senior administration officials for having underestimated the sheer cynicism and bloody-mindedness of Bashar al-Assad. If a mistake was made in terms of those statements a few days ago, in my view, it's a mistake not likely to be repeated. I think it's occurred to the administration that this battle against violent extremism focused on Daesh in Syria and elsewhere is not going to be won if Bashar al-Assad is permitted, in effect, to recruit for ISIS and al-Qaeda by conducting mass homicide, mass casualty operations against defenseless civilians. I suspect the administration will be looking in the near term at ways and means to complicate Assad's free ride for civilian mass terror, to complicate, obstruct, and if possible, end the free ride. Not only does the regime methodology recruit for Daesh and al-Qaeda, there is, in my view, absolutely no possibility of sustainable and productive peace talks in Syria so long as Syrian civilians are on the bullseye, day in and day out. It simply will not happen. And I wonder if Mr. Assad may have had this very much in mind when he decided to launch this operation. My sense is that no one in the Trump administration wants to invade and occupy Mr. Assad's piece of Syria. No one in this administration, to the best of my knowledge, is planning violent regime change in Syria. But Assad kills with absolute confidence, supported by an absolute sense of impunity. No doubt, an American president who has said he's deeply offended by what happens, by what has happened, asks himself a couple of questions. Where is it written that pilots dropping weapons of mass terror on children be unopposed in doing so. Who has decided that the airbase from which this operation was launched should be immune from suffering the consequences of having launched that operation? Is exacting a price, ending the free ride for mass homicide, is this something that is actually beyond the wit of the West and the United States? Is the risk of doing something so huge as to justify the horrific costs associated with doing nothing? Does never again actually mean, well, maybe just this once? I imagine that there will be high-level discussions with Moscow on what's happened and what needs to be done. I strongly suspect, I'll certainly defer to my Russian colleague on this, but I strongly suspect that Russia knows what happened. I'd like to think that Moscow regards the behavior of its client as gratuitously stupid and perhaps even hostile to Russian attempts to support peace talks. Perhaps the Trump administration will offer Moscow the chance to get its client out of the mass casualty business, not just chemicals, but mass casualty across the board, get him out of that business once and for all. I don't know whether Moscow has the intent or the leverage to make that happen. A clear indication of intent, however, will be how Russia characterizes the facts of this chemical attack in private, high-level discussions with American counterparts. So, Joe, to sum up, President Trump will either adopt his predecessor's Syria policy as his own, or he will act to end the Assad regime's free ride for mass murder. Letting that ride proceed unopposed would suggest that the battle against violent extremism in Syria and beyond is something less than a serious undertaking. Assad has communicated his defiance and his contempt. The reply to defiance, contempt, and mass murder will, in my view, help to define this new American administration.
Thank you, Fred. I'll get back probably to this aspect of the struggle against Daesh and the war in eastern Syria. But since you, you mentioned Russia and you gave me the proper transition to Nikolai, the question, to put this chemical issue in perspective, this chemical attack, and I agree with what Fred said, could be read as a kind of cornering to Russia, because in fact it put Russia in a kind of embarrassing situation. And also at the same time, we could think that, like in 2013, after the Ghouta attack, it would be an occasion to, let's say, densify the American-Russian linkage on Syria and work on something like the chemical issue. This leads me to the core question, the more global question. What is the state exactly today of the dialogue between Russia and the US on Syria? Of course, a bit before the Trump administration, but mainly after the Trump administration. Fred mentioned that what would be crucial would be to know what is the way the Russians characterized the incident of before yesterday in private. What is the state of these private talks? Are the relations between Russia and the US on Syria resuming? Is there a hotline on that? We have noticed that there's no American high-level envoy in Astana or even in Geneva last time. So how would you characterize this relation today? And is there the slightest beginning of understanding on an end game for Syria between the two big powers?
Well, thank you very much for these questions, but by asking them, you're challenging me with a very difficult task to fit in the answer of several hours in just 8 minutes. um, First and foremost, I would like to say that when describing Russia as an almighty or, well, a very important player in the Middle East, sometimes we're deceiving ourselves because the situation in which Russia is now is very tricky for Moscow. On the one hand, it got involved in the conflict without actually a clear vision of how to get out of it, or at least after several months of the military attack, of the military campaign, it's realized that actually the calculations about the possibility to finish this war quick, they appeared to be wrong, and now it needs to somehow to model the situation in a way to be able to get out of this conflict. And secondly, it's to again, I'm a little bit concerned, confused with using the word allies. I would say occasional partners, Damascus and Tehran. They not always follow the general line the Moscow would like them to follow, and they, I would say, sometimes make actions that goes against the Russian interest in terms of the settlement of the conflict. And I'm afraid that this incident with the use of the chemical weapon is just clearly demonstrated that Moscow's ability to control Assad and to well, put him in the line of the Russian vision, the line of the Russian strategy, they are extremely limited. From this point of view, it's definitely important for Moscow to develop the further dialogue on Syria with the international community. And while we see in the Russian diplomats and senior officials in the recent month prior to the U.S. elections stating that we can try to do it on our own by launching the Astana process, it became quite clear when they invited still the U.S. Representatives that it was rather a political game, allowing Russians to show off at the international arena. But as a matter of fact, Moscow would like to have this channel open. So far, the progress in Russian-U.S. dialogue on Syria after Trump's election, they are not that much fascinating. We've seen some occasional cooperation, like the discussion of the deconfliction issues. Like still, you mentioned Astana saying that this process, well, still under the question to what extent it's successful. But I would like to emphasize that during the second Astana meeting, we had the low-level American representation there, so we still could say that the channels are open, and that was quite important. And finally, we're also allegedly seeing certain dialogue on the situation around Manbij in Syria. But that's basically it. The question is whether this cooperation will go further on or stop at the current level. Again, it doesn't have one answer. And by the way, today we have not only one Russian in this panel, but we have 4 really good experts on Russia and Syria sitting just in the third row. So I would appreciate if we can drag them in discussion as well, because their vision of the situation may be different from mine. I'm mostly playing the role of a pessimist. Because while definitely there is an understanding that it is Assad is incapable basically to grab the control of the Syria and reach the military solution of the Syrian conflict, and it's important to talk to the U.S. and partly I've in my talks with some Russian policymakers and government analysts, I heard certain hints that they would like to have a more active and effective dialogue on Syria. But from my point of view, there are a lot of obstacles for this dialogue nowadays. First and foremost is definitely the huge luggage of mistrust that we have at the different levels of the decision-making process in Moscow. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a specialist on the US, but in the US as well. Secondly, it's still Russia and the US and the international community, they may probably see actually the very concept of the main issue of this conflict in a different way. For Moscow, it is what it calls the destabilization of the government institutions that push in Syria and compels the Russians to struggle for the survival of these institutions, but ultimately for the survival of the regime. For the West, for the US, it's still the Islamic State, the radical Islam that matters more. But for the Russians, it's only just the product of the problem, and they would like to address to the source of that. So this difference also make quite a lot of troubles. And finally, thirdly, there is also, even if we're speaking about the products of this conflict, the vision of these products is different. For Moscow, it's much more important the numbers of the Russian-speaking jihadists in Syria rather than the existence of Daesh itself. It still believes that the Islamic State or the jihadists is something that's bound to the region. And they wouldn't like to fight with them, believing that it's much more a problem for the regional states, for Europe, for the US, rather than for Russia itself. That also makes a whole difference. And finally, Moscow is trapped by its broader regional strategy on the Middle East, which is based on the principle of balancing between different regional powers. And whatever decision it makes in dialogue with the West, it should take into account the opinion of Tehran, which is quite important for Moscow on a number of other issues as well, which are not related, and not always related to Syria. It needs to keep in mind its interest in the development of the dialogue with the Gulf states, especially in Russian interests related to the financial capitals. And it also needs to keep in mind the interests of Egypt and Israel. So, and this necessity of balancing between different players, it also puts natural limits on those concessions and agreements it can make with the relations with the West on Syria. To sum up, I managed to make
30
it in
seconds.
To sum up, I would say that we will definitely see Russian attempts to continue the dialogue, but this dialogue will be extremely limited. It will be extremely long before we reach results, because again, I would like to emphasize, Moscow is not under the pressure of time. And any results achieved, we should not expect the big results. I guess the progress will be very small.
Thank you, Nikolai. In fact, on this issue of the time pressure, I'll get back to you on the second round of questions, but you gave me also, once again, a transition to Ambassador Mousavian and to Iran. A few days ago, I don't know if you have seen that, Wall Street Journal had a very important article saying in a kind of blunt manner, Iran is the winner of Syria. Iran has won in Syria. My question is, to what extent the feeling in Tehran is that, in fact, Syria was a victory for Iran? I know that you will tell me that it's not exactly the case and etc. But if you look at the statement of even some very consequential Pasdaran leaders, they boast on that. I mean, they really go very far, saying that this is a historical victory and it will be followed by others in the region. To what extent the Iranian leadership is perceiving that it has won in Syria, and the corollary question, it has to do with what Nikolai was saying. To what extent or how is Tehran perceiving the way of sharing this victory with the other victor in Syria, who is today Russia? I mean, what is the state also of the Russian-Iranian, let's say, dialogue over Syria?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, we had 3 very heartbreaking civilian issue during last 4 or 5 days, which everyone should regret. And if there is any action to protect civilians, it should be beyond one issue. One definitely was the chemical weapons, Syrians, 70 people, Syrians, innocent civilians, they were killed. Yesterday, we had 33 young Syrians beheaded by ISIS. 2 days before, we had 12 Syrians, civilians, beheaded by ISIS, 45 people in 3, 4, 5 days, which no one is talking about. 4, 5, 6 days ago, we had 200 civilians killed, innocent civilians, by US military strike at Mosul. And they are civilians. It doesn't matter whether this is the US strike or ISIS or chemical weapon by opposition or by Assad. Therefore, if we are really worried about civilians, we should be more serious. This is one. Second, Iranians, they believe Syrian crisis till now is completely lose-lose game for everyone. For Syrian nation, for Assad government, for the US, for Iran, for Russia, for Saudi Arabia, there is no winner. If anyone makes such a statement in Tehran, giving you such a feeling, they say the notion of regime change by the use of military force in Syria has failed. This is different with feeling a winning situation in Syria. However, Joe, if you are in Washington in such a panels reading the papers, if you go to Tehran, you would see 100% different narratives, perceptions, understanding. First of all, Iranians, they really never believe the US and the West is serious about chemical weapons. And this is just a political instrument because they say during Saddam invasion of Iran, Saddam used chemical weapons. 100,000 Iranians, not 70 or 100, 100,000 Iranians. They were either killed or injured. And the US and Europe both provided Saddam with material and technology to use chemical weapons. Therefore, you really cannot convince them. They hate chemical weapons. Second, any chemical weapon, incidents of chemical weapon use in Syria, immediately, minute one, the US and Europe immediately blames Assad. Before any investigation, immediately. It means the US and the Europe, they trust ISIS and Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups.
Sorry, please. Okay, you can leave the room, but please, sorry, yes. Okay. Okay, please go.
Second, they say the US used the excuse of weapons of mass destruction, attacked Iraq to bring regime change. And everyone understood it was a lie. The NATO used the excuse of weapons of mass destruction, attacked Libya to bring regime change in Libya, and then everybody understood this is a lie. Therefore, there is a big gap, whether we like it or not, this is a fact, between Iranian understanding and the US and the Western understanding on the use of weapons of mass destruction. Iranians are the biggest victim of the chemical weapons after the Second World War. Therefore, they should never and they would never support the use of chemical weapons. Second, on Syrian crisis or the regional issues, Joe, if you go to Tehran to talk to everyone and tell them Assad is dictator, and that's why the US and the West is fighting Assad. Assad is a very nasty dictator. They would say this is 40, 50, 60 years of US policy supporting dictators in the region. From Shah, Mubarak, all corrupted dictator regimes supported by the US. Therefore, democracy or dictatorship is not an issue for the US and should not be an issue because they have been supporting dictators for decades. It is not. If you say this is humanitarian issue or democracy, they would tell you the US is supporting their allies in the region with zero democracy and providing with the most sophisticated arms, killing every day thousands or hundreds of Yemenis. And they are human. This is US or European arms. It doesn't matter, this is in Syria, and by those regimes with zero human right and democracy. Therefore, Iranians, they see the Syrian issue a part of grand strategy of the US in the region, related to Iraq, Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, supporting Yemen, supporting the terrorist groups in Syria. They believe the US is after hegemony in the region. That's why there is really a big gap coming to one case to discuss whether Assad is dictator or not, or chemical weapons are good or bad. At the end, I think it was for the first time after the nuclear deal in October 2015, Iran was invited by the world powers to Syrian international dialogue or meeting in Geneva. And there was 9, 8, 10 principles agreed, and Iran fully supported, including peaceful transition, including free election by Syrian nation supervised by United Nations Security Council, including the unity and integrity of Syria. And I think if there is going an international move to support the same principles, Tehran would accommodate.
So, okay, we left aside the second part of my question, which at least for me was important. I mean, how would you share this victory or the situation with Russia? I suggest that we transfer it to the second round of question. Since
I would agree with him that Iran and Russia, they have more common interests, commonalities in the region, confronting the West.
Can we transfer that? I mean, keep your remarks for the second round of question, because just to keep the time straight, since we are approaching the issue in terms of quote-unquote winners and losers, Ghalib, the perception from outside, especially lately, is that in fact, since at least the coup d'etat and the aftermath of the coup d'etat in Turkey, Turkey has really made a U-turn on Syria. It has completely shifted policy. And this is partly or mainly led by the fact that Turkey perceived itself as being on the losing side on Syria for a while. And then it is looking for ways to cut the losses. Is this perception true first? And second, if this is true, what are the second best for Turkey in Syria? I mean, is today Turkey only concerned about the northern part, about, let's say, immunizing the border on the northern part? Is there any view on Damascus, on the change of political system in Damascus? Or is it only now a matter of even more defensive approach, a completely domestic Turkish affair having to do with the survival, quote unquote, of the Erdogan political system? How can we see that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joe, for the invitation. I will start actually by making a bit of comparison of what Frederick has said, and what Turkey is right now experiencing. Turkey, in a sense, like despite the tension between the Turkey and the US when it comes to Syria, actually the approach to Syrian policies start to resemble each other quite significantly, and that's why actually Turkey has changed the track in Syria. First, as it is the case right now with the US, at least from the outside, that the Syrian issue has been reduced to the war on ISIS, in a sense like the Syrian policy has been reduced to a factor to US's ISIS policy or a component of the US ISIS policy. Now you see also Turkey reducing the Syrian crisis to, again, another war on terror, and the Turkey-Syrian policy has been reduced to a factor to its PKK-PYD policy. As the US has been, using quite significantly, I like also the vocabulary that Frederick has used, the action-free and the rhetoric-rich, putting aside the Euphrates Shield operation, Turkey's recent Syria policy has been also quite action-free and rhetoric-rich. And the only exception in this case, I think, was relatively successful Euphrates Shield operation. And thirdly, as the U.S. has effectively given up on the regime change, at least practically, and actually the Tillerson has said even the fate of the Assad is something that the Syrians themselves should decide. And the follow-up question, then why on earth, what are you doing on Syria? One should ask him probably. Turkey also has effectively, despite the rhetoric, has transitioned from the regime change agenda to some kind of regime reform agenda. And given the fact that regime reform agenda is not a likely scenario, is not the likely option to work, what we see, Turkey turn this into a counter-terrorism strategy or a border protection strategy. Right now, what you see effectively a policy that tries to minimize the negative security externalities of the Syrian crisis on Turkey. So in this regard, this Turkey-Syrian crisis has very much is domestically driven, and it's driven by Turkey's national security and national security threats, perception, or challenges. So in this regard, yes, unfortunately, what we have seen is, in the last 1 year, actually a bit more than this, Turkey has transitioned the policy in Syria effectively. And will Turkey reverse its idea of this policy? It's very much dependent whether the U.S. will be willing to reverse its idea of its Syrian policy, whether the U.S. will once again go into the business of the regime change. If the U.S. is not going to go into the business of the regime change, and given the fact that the Gulf states are not as sanguine as they were a couple of years ago, I think Turkey alone feels that it is beyond its capacity to effectively go for the regime change agenda. Turkey will be willing to go for the regime change agenda if once again it sees its allies, particularly the U.S., is in this business. So unless and until we have this, I don't see how it is going to happen. So what is the policy then? Well, the policy is very much, when you look at Turkey's policy towards Syria, three things is very clearly. A, Turkey has downsized its ambitions. B, Turkey doesn't have a Syria policy anymore. Turkey has a northern Syria policy. And actually, Turkey's regional policies, when you look at the geographic space of Turkey's regional policy, it extends from northern Syria and northern Iraq, and there is 2 or 3 things that it is grappling. The Kurdish issue or the PKK-PYD belt, and reducing the negative security externalities of the Syrian crisis or the regional collapse. And the thirdly, basically, trying to curtail the Iranian influence as much as possible. So when you look at these 3 things, this is 3 major things that define the current Turkey's regional policy today, and Turkey's Syrian policy as well too. So what Turkey is going to do, it is kind of implementing some kind of stabilization politics with the Euphrates Shield operation, particularly from the areas that it has cleared the ISIS. It is trying to put some kind of governance structure. It has actually quite successfully done in Jarablus area, from police training to putting education institution to training some other structure of governance. It will expand on this policy all the way to the Al-Bab, and it will play to the time to see how the situation on the ground is changing and what are the options that the opposition realistically has. And thirdly, Turkey will continue this policy of trying to prevent the formation of a PKK-PYD belt extending from Shingal all the way to Afrin. So, but previously Turkey did this through quite military options with the Euphrates Shield operation. But after the Al-Bab, Turkey had to make decisions, and this decision, to be honest, had only 2 components. After the Al-Bab, Turkey would have either targeted the PYD PKK or halt the operation, because in the end, getting rid of the ISIS in the whole of the Syria was not the priority. The priority was getting an ISIS-free borders, and down the road, the war on ISIS was a factor of Turkey's war on PKK-PYD. If Turkey saw benefits of fighting ISIS also in Raqqa, would help Turkey to gain some leverage vis-a-vis the PKK-PYD, then Turkey would be interested in this deal. But feeling that there is a decoupling and the U.S. is not interested in giving up on the PYD and PKK, At this stage, Turkey is not also in the mood of continuing the fight against the ISIS towards Raqqa unless it sees a tangible results vis-a-vis the PKK-YD. And particularly with the U.S. forces in Manbij area, the regime forces coming to Manbij area, the Russian forces in Manbij area, the Russian forces in also Afrin. Basically, the military options of the Euphrates Shields operation was no longer there vis-a-vis the PKK-PYD, and that's why you see the Turkey has terminated it. And at this stage, you will see a much more stabilization politics that Turkey will be undertaking in Syria.
Thank you, Ghalib. These are very candid remarks for some of them. Interesting. Fred, I'll go back to you. And in this second round of questions, please, I would require you to have short answers because really we would like to have a dialogue with the audience. But one or two things. First of all, it's noticeable that from at least, I mean, Nikolai and Ghalib, it's very different, of course, in the case of Ambassador Mousavian. There's a lot of, let's say, waiting or expectation on what will be the decision of the US in order to design the policy for the next period. Ghalib was very candid in saying, since the US has stopped the regime change business, as you called it, we stopped it. If you resume it, we will resume it, which is a way of, I mean, addressing something to the US. But it's not exactly what I would like to launch you on. But you said before, you mentioned the ISIS component, the Daesh component. Let's agree that this is the priority of Washington for the years to come. The questions that are looming in DC and elsewhere are, first of all, on Raqqa and other Daesh provinces. What will be the efficient and available, I mean, realistically available mix of forces that would take and then govern these spaces? And second, corollary, how will this be designed? I mean, the eastern part of Syria, how will it be managed, designed, and etc. With the Russians in the coming years, according to what you know about the state of, let's say, of thinking in the U.S. administration?
Yeah, Joe, I think this is, this is one area where there is an advanced state of thinking in the executive branch of the U.S. government with respect to Syria. And you've outlined very well the key issues that the U.S. Department of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Staff are struggling with right now. Since 2014, the Defense Department has been faced with the reality that its only effective ground force combat component is what is now a Kurdish-dominated militia. This obviously presents problems with respect to Turkey. Speaking personally, I've been calling for the better part of 2 years for the United States to take the diplomatic initiative in forming a professional ground force coalition of the willing to work with coalition air forces to finish Daesh in eastern Syria and to execute a professional, sensible post-combat stabilization plan for the area. Point one of which would have to be the exclusion of the Assad regime from eastern Syria. It would make absolutely no sense to expend blood and treasure closing with and killing Daesh and then permit this regime to reestablish itself in the area. There are, from a professional point of view, and I say this as a former long ago military professional, there are some real dilemmas as the U.S. Department of Defense looks at how to take Raqqa. As far as I understand it, right now, there will be militiamen, albeit with some American advisors, walking point, being up front when the actual operation to take the city commences. In my view, this is extraordinarily dangerous. Fighting in built-up areas, fighting in urban areas is a highly refined art form that is resident in very few professional militaries, right? And we run the risk here, quite frankly, of inadvertently creating a real humanitarian disaster in Raqqa. I believe this is the wrong way to go about it. But again, for over 2 years now, the Department of Defense has been stuck with one kind of a ground force component which incidentally has performed well in many instances. But now when you're facing the very specific task of taking a city that may have well over 200,000 people in it, a place that's thoroughly booby-trapped against an enemy that will resort literally to anything in terms of victimizing civilians. And you don't want to put American and coalition air forces in the position of hitting inadvertently civilian targets based on on poor target acquisition. And I'll conclude by saying, I appreciate our Iranian colleagues' depiction of attitudes in Tehran. I believe it's perfectly accurate. I think he's done a real service in what he's portrayed here. It tracks 100% with track 2 discussions I've had with Iranians for about 2.5 years. My only comment would be, there is a world of difference. It is inevitable in fighting in urban areas in particular. There are going to be civilian casualties. It is absolutely inevitable. It is unavoidable. It makes a big difference, though, whether or not one is operating on the basis of military doctrine and training that seeks to avoid civilian casualties as opposed to a political strategy that has the creation of civilian casualties as its centerpiece. There's a massive difference.
Thank you, Fred. I will follow up on that with Ghalib, because this Raqqa issue, or the eastern part of Syria, you mentioned a lot that, in fact, the dilemma of Western, let's say, the coalition, let's say, is that it is stuck with the only battling force, which is today PYD or SDF, or something with a strong Kurdish component. Yeah. And this leads us to a real question for Ankara. I think you concluded by saying that, in fact, today, mainly the concern of Turkey is that aspect. If we project ourselves a bit further down the road and just try to envisage a kind of future Syria, how far and what is really the red line, to use an unfortunate expression, what is acceptable for Turkey in terms of quote-unquote Kurdish, let's say, existence in the north of Syria, autonomy, existence, canton, and what is the ultimate limit that Ankara could accept on that level?
Well, I think the concept of acceptable no longer is valid, because so many things that Turkey previously said it's not acceptable to itself, but it has become acceptable in one way or another. Unfortunately, Assad regime was not acceptable. But recently, when the regime forces came to around the Manbij, the prime minister said, well, it is the lesser evil. So that means as the war progresses, as the war evolves, the actors within the war also evolving their strategy as well too. The Talabiyat was not acceptable to Turkey, but now it's a fact. The further expansion of the PYD along the Turkish border was not acceptable to Turkey, but it has become a reality. The crucial question here is, what is Turkey and the PKK, what will be the next stage for Turkey and PKK? Because the question of the PYD, is very much related to the question of the PKK. Let's not forget, until 2015, the Salih Muslim was in Ankara, visiting and coming to Ankara, meeting the undersecretary of the Foreign Ministry and other high officials. So there was some kind of a functioning dialogue between the Turkey and the PYD as well too. When the Kurdish peace process in Turkey broke down, particularly with the urban warfare prevailing in the second half of the 2015, then what was practical, what was to some extent acceptable in Syria, became unacceptable from Turkey's perspective. Here, I think one thing that the U.S. could have done, but for one way or another hasn't done so, U.S. could make its support for the PYD conditional, and in that way, it could create some kind of dialogue between the U.S., Turkey, and the PYD. When I say conditional, is this one? I think the PYD-istan or the PKK-istan is regarded as unacceptable, but I think some form of Kurdistan could be relatively more acceptable. And in order to turn this from PKK-istan or PYD-istan to Kurdistan, that would have required the U.S. pressuring the PYD to let the Kurdish component to be present and to freely operate in Syria and to be integrated into the administrative and the security structure of the Kurdish part of the Syria. And now you have a couple thousands of the Rosh Peshmerga in Iraq, for instance. This could be one of the first steps to bring this Rosh Peshmerga into the governance or the security structure of the Syria. I think that could have been one of the first steps that would have started a process. Because right now, the fact that it is not the Kurdistan, because of all the Kurdish leadership in the region, the Barzani is the most nationalist and the most pro-independent figure in the whole region Kurdish politics. And it is the one also has the best relation with Turkey. Today, when you put aside Qatar, Turkey has the best relation with Iraqi Kurdistan. So in this regard, I think making military aid conditional, or down the road, the reconstruction aid conditional on the good behavior of the PYD, and the first one to start with the letting other Kurdish parties, starting with the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Syria, to operate and be integrated into Syria, would have created a dialogue between Turkey, US, and Syrian Kurds. And I think still there is a chance for this. And I think after the referendum, there might be new dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the sense is that there's also a domestic Turkish component.
Sure.
A lot of that relies on the future state of dialogue or peace talks between Öcalan, PKK, and Ankara at one point. And
Syria policy is a domestic policy for Turkey, period.
It's often a domestic policy for a lot of people,
Exactly.
mainly also maybe for Iran, in a way. As you said it, Ambassador Mousavian, I'll get back to you. The part of the question that was not answered before, the relation with Russia and how, let's assume, if there is a kind of condominium between Russia and Iran over Syria, at least this was the case until now, how is it divided? How is it shared? And what are the spheres of very strong, let's say, complicity between the two and the spheres of friction? And there are frictions between the two. The second part of the question, to put it also in that respect, with the new stance of the American administration that is now much bolder against Iran in the region and maybe in Syria, what are Tehran's, let's say, plan Bs in case the new American administration takes the decision to really fight or curb Iran in Syria, and not to mention, of course, the Israeli factor that we have seen appearing lately. Yesterday evening, for example, the strong strikes by Israeli Air Force on some Hezbollah positions in Daraa and elsewhere. So how will Iran, let's say, manage its quote-unquote victory over Syria with these partners, with Russia, the Americans, and mainly tomorrow the Israelis?
I think there is a clear understanding in Tehran that there cannot be a winner in Syria if the notion of winning is a criteria either for Iran or Saudi Arabia or Russia or the US. They are looking for a collective cooperation to resolve the Syrian crisis peacefully on some basis. One base definitely would be preserving the integrity and unity of Syria, because the collapse, disintegration of Syria would have many consequences in the region, Iraq, Jordan, and many other countries. I think here Russia and Iran, they are in the same page. And even Syrian opposition, I talk to everyone, they are in the same page. But I think the most important issues which caused Iran-Russia cooperation on Syria are twofold. One is terrorism. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, it is a great threat to Russia, you know, Central Asia, Chechnya, and you have seen the St. Petersburg explosion and many terror activities in Russia before. And this is exactly the same big national threat to Iranian security. Specifically about the fact ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Ahrar al-Sham, all of them, they are coming from one source of ideology. And Iranians believe they are funded ideologically, weapon, money from one source to destabilize Iran. And this is the same understanding in Russia. That's why I would say a real fighting against ISIS, Al-Qaeda is the main target, not only in Syria. The Iranians are doing in Iraq also. They are at the forefront fighting ISIS. Tens of Iranian military, they have been killed in Iraq or in Syria fighting ISIS. The second is about, as I said before, which Moscow and Tehran, they share, to my understanding, is to prevent the US policy of bringing regime change in the region by force or by supporting the terrorists. Because they have the experience of US invasion of Iraq, US invasion of Libya, or NATO invasion. They have now, they see the US support for Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Yemen. And they have been struggling with US for 38 years on Iranian issue, because it is known to everyone the US has been for regime change in Iran. Therefore, they have a bigger grand strategy in the region, regardless of what is happening in Syria.
Okay, so you don't want to address the issue of the US and maybe Israel?
No, Israel,
Very quickly.
yeah, no, very quickly. There is, if you read the papers, I was this morning, early morning, I woke up and I read 3 articles in 3 Iranian papers. They saying this is a grand strategy by US and Israel, because the US is going to depart the region. They don't need anymore the Persian Gulf or Middle East oil. And they want to bring the superiority, the dominance of Israel to the region. That's why the big rivalries of Israel, like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen, all of them are collapsing. And they are saying in this way that this, and also they say, you can read it today, they say Assad was at the forefront fighting Israel, occupation and supporting. This is all about supporting Israel, weakening the Muslim countries, fighting Israeli-Palestinian issue, and also the US. However, I already said about the US grand strategy, how Iranians, they view the region. It is not about Syria, about the whole region. And this is about Israel. Is it enough?
It's okay. So in fact, what I understand is that the narrative in Tehran is still the one of the Mumana, I mean,
Yeah.
the resistentialist
Yes.
camp.
Yes.
Okay. Nikolai, before, I mean, giving the floor to the audience, let's get back a little bit to the Russian internal situation. You said something very important before, which is for me paradoxical a little bit, that Russia has time. I mean, it's not under pressure in Syria. That time is not let's say, aggressive factor, but in fact, the sense that we can have, analysts, some of us, is that on the contrary, because Russia feels today that it has a need to translate quite quickly its military, let's say, might over Syria, or at least over the airspace of Syria, into some kind of political architecture that would allow it to, if not withdraw, but at least minimize the cost of managing the day-to-day issue. So first of all, how long can Russia play the game in Syria without getting sunk into the muds of Syria and getting into a kind of new attrition war, Afghanistan style, and etc.? And second, if Russia has a design for Syria tomorrow, and this would be a transition to the second panel about the political solution in Syria, what is the perception of Russia for today's Syria if it has to preserve its own national interests?
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your questions. Though I'm really tempted to comment what my Iranian colleague has said just about the common vision of the goals. It's not common, I'm afraid. It's not the united vision of the goals. The goals, I'm afraid, they are pursuing are, at least from long-term perspective, they are different. But that's a separate story. Speaking about your question, first of all, it's not the reality, but I would say our perception of this reality that determines our strategy and tactics. It could be applied both to Tehran, to the United States, to Russia. I would definitely agree with you that there is a pressure of time in reality, and Moscow is getting more and more soaked in this conflict. And while the Russian authorities are officially saying that it's just an operation of Russian air forces, it has been long for quite a long period of time that it started to be something more than just an operation of Russian air forces, and the losses are getting higher and higher. But the perception of Moscow, of the Kremlin, is a little bit different. They still believe that the profits they get from their involvement in Syria are higher than the cost. They, especially after the Aleppo operation, when they see themselves changing the situation in their favor, they became extremely confident. And the very fact that we start hearing from Ankara, from Washington, that replacing Assad is not a priority, is also add the self-confidence to Moscow that it is having an upper hand. I still do have hopes that the chemical attack, this disastrous chemical attack that we've seen yesterday, it will change the narrative about Assad destiny, and that might affect Moscow and start and compel it thinking about say whether it's have upper hand or not. But the general perception there is that yes, we have troubles, but our positions are strong, and we are able to model to shape the public opinion not only domestically, because domestically again this campaign is portrayed as a pure success, but also on the international arena as well. And from this point of view, Moscow is interested in talking with the United States, and it knows that without working with international with international players, and especially with the regional players, it will be difficult to settle this issue. That's why we have Astana. But somewhere in the back of their mind, they do believe that if the current attempt to launch this political process in Syria, to launch a dialogue with the supporters of the Syrian opposition, fails, they still can continue pursuing the two-track approach when they put military pressure on the ground and they offering the relaunching of the negotiations at the diplomatic level. So far, I haven't seen the change of this strategy, and I have doubts that it has changed. It will change anytime soon.
Thank you very much. We have now around 30 minutes for a dialogue with all of you. I would ask you first to, when you take the floor, to present yourself very quickly and say what's your affiliation and name, And then second, please try to be brief and mainly put a question forward to the audience, to the panel, and ask one of them, or address your question to one of them. Many hands are raised. I think the first one was here.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Saman. I'm the director of Syria Advice Center based here in Washington, D.C. I'm Syrian American. My question to Mr. Hoff regarding Iran's invasion in Syria. It seems that President Trump is very serious about kicking out Iranians from Syria. My question, sir, what do you think would be the consequences of the Iranian regime internally? Some says that this is going to be very serious. It could lead to the collapse of this regime. Do you see this happening? Thank you.
I think what I can say on the basis of 2.5 years of periodic, very, very, very intensive track 2 dialogue with very senior former Iranian officials, people still connected to the government in Tehran. I think what I can say accurately is something that perhaps we haven't really mentioned this morning. That what is important for Iran in Syria is really Hezbollah, okay? And the willingness of President Assad and his regime to subordinate themselves and the part of Syria they control to Iran for the sake of Hezbollah. One of my Iranian counterparts, incidentally, a person educated in the United States, on a personal level, very well disposed toward the United States, made the statement, Fred, you've got to understand, Hezbollah is more important to us than the province of Khuzestan. I mean, that was just very, very, very point blank. So, if there is some, diminution of Iranian influence in Syria over time, I don't know that it goes directly to the survivability of the Islamic Revolution back in Tehran, but it would go directly to the ability of Iran to use Syria in support of Hezbollah, Hezbollah being the point of Iran's spear penetrating the Arab world.
David Pollock in the back. I'm trying to be a bit geographical distribution.
Thank you very much. I'm Dave Pollock from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. And my question is to Professor Mousavian. You presented an Iranian view, as you called it, which is that there's one source of jihadi terrorism, that its one goal is to destabilize Iran, and that Iranians believe that this is the goal of the United States, regime change in Tehran. But I don't think you were very clear, at least I didn't quite understand whether you think this is the view of the Iranian government in its entirety, of the Iranian people in their entirety, or is this also your own personal assessment of the realities in the region? And when you said that jihadi terrorism has one source, who do you mean? Saudi Arabia, the US, Israel, all three? Or is there something else going on here? Is there a sectarian aspect to this that you didn't mention? Thank you.
I think on the second part, you don't need to hear from me. I'm sure you read New York Times op-ed written by Friedman revealing a confidential report 2010, Hillary Clinton saying Saudi Arabia is the main source of funding and supporting ISIS and terrorism. I'm sure you read already President Obama interview with Atlantic, who said Saudis have been supporting Wahhabism, the extreme ideology, for decades with huge money. I'm sure you
It's more or less that.
Yeah, but I'm sure you read the statement by Vice President Biden at Harvard 2014, who said our main problem is with our own allies, which they are supporting terrorist group to bring regime change in Syria. Even President Trump, during election, publicly officially said Saudi Arabia is the source number one supporting the terrorists. It is the US, either Republicans or Democrats. And this is the general view also in Iran. I mean, at least if there is one communality between Iran and the US, this is the communality. On your first question, it is about the thought, the understanding of the decision makers in Iran. People, you would find many, many different ideas in Iranian streets. If you go to Tehran streets, that would be very different about many, many issues. It is not only about Syria, but it is about the understanding or the belief of the decision makers.
No. The gentleman with the, with the.
I'm gonna sit down.
He's very
Quickly. How you doing? My name is Hamid Imam. I'm a Syrian American. I'm from Raqqa myself, and I just want to convey the outcries that's coming from inside. There are two concerns. There are security concerns, and there's military concerns. The military concerns are they are trapped inside. They're unable to leave. So, and now with the exclusion of the rules of engagement, so they are unable to flee. And also there is the existence of demographics that SDF, the campaign, that they don't have any Arab faction part of it. So there is serious concerns of real demographic change. So what can we do to minimize that? And second question quickly is, has the Iranian people seen the horrific pictures of Caesar where over 100,000 people were mutilated and tortured to death, and how would they feel about that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm James Kefford. I'm with the Public International Law and Policy Group. My question is for you, sir. There's been reports about the new administration contemplating some kind of intervention. It's been aired. It's not clear. You yourself used the phrase coalition of the willing, which has reminiscence of Iraq in 2003. What sort of idea would you have that wouldn't lead to a similar outcome, given that that seems to be kind of what's being contemplated at the moment?
Should I go ahead with that?
Yes, please.
Joe, because they're
Two
related.
questions,
They're
take
related
them
questions.
together.
On the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, to the best of my knowledge, there is a rather sizable non-Kurdish element to this force, largely Arab. My sense of what is planned is that the Arab elements of the SDF will be playing a major role in the actual attempt to take Raqqa. This highlights it just highlights my concern, and I just say this as somebody, not trying to micromanage the affairs of the U.S. Department of Defense. That's not my interest at all. In fact, I have a professional aversion to that. But I also have a real professional concern about how this operation is going to be executed and its potential impact on civilians living in Raqqa. In terms of the coalition of the willing, what I was calling for very soon, as a matter of fact, after the atrocities in Paris in late 2015, that the United States mount the kind of diplomatic initiative that Secretary of State Jim Baker did concerning the liberation of Kuwait, and that we put together a professional ground force to put an end to Daesh in eastern Syria. And obviously, a very important and a very complex component of doing that is going beyond the combat operations to post-combat stabilization. And again, as a one-time U.S. Army Civil Affairs officer, I have some very detailed knowledge about how difficult this is. Nothing I've proposed in terms of alternatives, at least I've tried, not to suggest that there are silver bullets and easy answers to any of this. But I still believe very firmly that taking down ISIS with professional military forces, particularly in densely populated, built-up areas, is far preferable to relying on militiamen.
Thank you, Fred. I would like to use my privilege, if you allow me, to also take benefit of the presence in the room, like as Nikolai has mentioned, of three very high-level Russian experts that are here visiting Washington by coincidence, to try to get their sense on this issue. But you have the task to choose one of you, in fact. Okay, please.
Thank you. I actually wanted to ask a question, but I'll probably. My name is Yuri Barman. I'm a Middle East analyst from Moscow. I'll probably first ask two questions to you, Mr. Hoff. Do you have what's the feeling in Washington about how to engage Moscow in the Middle East, specifically on Syria? Because it feels like Nikki Haley, she came in and she got the talking points, Samantha Power's talking points, and she pursues the same line, while Rex Tillerson and as well as Mr. Trump are very soft on Russia, including in their recent comments about the chemical attack. So is there like a coherent policy already now in the
no.
And
go ahead.
Question to Galip, I think also, what's the feeling in Ankara now following the failure of the Astana talks recent round and all different various conflicts between Moscow and Ankara over like agriculture and stuff like that? Is clearly that happened after some disagreements between Turkey and Moscow. So what's the feeling in Ankara about working with Moscow and Iran on Syria? I don't know if you would like me to comment on Russia's Syria policy. I feel like domestically Syria policy is very important, and just like in Turkey and just like in Iran, I think it's part of the domestic policy. Ahead of the presidential elections in 2018, that's a very important element of Vladimir Putin's rhetoric, and saying that, look, we're being attacked by terrorists and we need to deal with that, and we need to deal with that externally before they come back and start attacking us. So in that sense, Syria is playing into Russia's hand. But I would say that presently Russia does not have a coherent policy on Syria as well. It's very opportunistic. It's they see an opening and they go in and they do what they can. But I would say that there's also no preferred outcome. I think there are red lines and there are best case scenarios, and there's an equilibrium that is going up and down between these 2 points. So I'm afraid, Moscow does not at this point have any.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I think there's a question for you, Fred, and a question to Galip, and then we'll get back to you.
Yeah, basically in terms of whether or not there is a coherent, fully formed idea of how to deal with Russia in the context of a broader national security strategy towards Syria. No, I mean, all kidding aside, that does not exist. And I think that's that's one of the reasons you have the likes of me up here trying to wing it, trying to represent as best I can the state of thinking in the administration, as opposed to having a real live senior official of the U.S. government up here speaking.
Believe me,
definitively.
we tried.
Yeah, and I fully understand why it would be difficult for any serving professional to be doing this. Obviously, during the presidential campaign, candidate Trump expressed at times a strong predisposition to work with Russia in the case of Syria, focusing on counterterrorism operations. He also at the time expressed openness to working with the Assad regime. The Assad element of that, as I indicated in my opening remarks, is gone, finished, dead, never to come back. Many miracles in the Middle East, but there will be no resurrection of that one. I can guarantee it. I think the administration is probably, or let's just say the president. I think the president is probably open to the idea of having some very senior level discussions with Moscow about what has happened most recently in Syria and what, if anything, can be done to put an end at long last to these mass casualty events, whether they're chemical or something else. It doesn't matter. This is not just about chemicals, okay? Because unless that ends, unless Syrian civilians come off the bullseye, there are no political prospects. And I think President Trump is willing to assume that Russia is interested in some kind of a sustainable process toward an agreed resolution politically in Syria. I think he's willing to assume that, and we'll see now if it's tested.
Yeah. Well, working with Russia and Iran was not what Turkey primarily preferred. It was Turkey saw this as practical. And as you just mentioned, with the recent chemical attacks, the Astana process has failed on its cardinal goal of enforcing ceasefire as well too. So Astana process actually was never a Turkish agenda. It was a more or less a Russian agenda, and Turkey just went along with the Astana process. And Astana process has actually served the purpose of, like, it served a good podium for Russia projecting not being as the decisive power in the war, but also the peacemaker, the primary peacemaker in the Syria. And what I saw is, like, it tried also to redesign the parameter of the political process and also the opposition itself as well too. It brought the question of constitution even before the political transition as well. So in this regard, I'm not sure whether Turkey has actually much expectation from the Astana process. Astana process was meant to be providing some kind of like breathing and space and time for the opposition, and until we see what can be done as next. But I was surprised actually to say that you saying that Russia doesn't have a preferred outcome in Syria, given all this investment. Russia seems to be like, choosing its partner in a much better strategic way than the US or Turkey does. Russia, besides from regime, Russia has been investing, is trying to like good relations. Okay, Russia is investing, into PYD. It is cultivating so-called like Moscow or the Cairo opposition as well too. So in a sense, it's not only like deciding what's the option the regime will have, but it is also very much redesigning the opposition camp as well too.
Thanks, Joe, and all panelists for this fascinating discussion. Ibrahim Al-Asil, Middle East Institute. And my question to you, Ambassador Hoff.
Can you raise your voice a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Ibrahim Al-Asil, Middle East Institute. And my question to Ambassador Hoff. We've heard a lot from candidate Trump and President Trump about the importance of fighting or confronting the Iranian behavior in Syria and other countries, and especially the Iranian-backed militias. What would you recommend for the U.S. administration if they want to deal with that problem in particular, Hezbollah and other militias, since they will be big destabilizers in the future for any scenario or possible solutions? So do you have any particular recommendations that you encourage the U.S. administration to do?
No, frankly, I don't on that score. I believe the entirety of the current effort has to focus on civilian protection and putting an end to the free ride for mass casualties. Obviously, you know, focusing on Iranian behavior inside Syria is a very, very important longer-term issue. My sense is that for the sake of supporting Hezbollah, Iran is a very important catalyst in the de-establishment of a unitary Syrian state. I believe that very strongly. I believe the Iranians are very active in establishing parallel institutions, if you will, very similar to what was done in Lebanon, and we can see the results there. So obviously, this is going to be something the administration is going to have to focus on. It's going to have to be a very, very important part of whatever national security strategy emerges for Syria. I have no near-term recommendations. I think unless we can stop the mass casualty events, there's no room for any kind of diplomacy.
We still have 10 minutes. I'll try to take as many questions as I can. There's already one, Basma.
Thank you. Basma Kodmani, Syrian opposition. My points are in relation with Ambassador Mousavian's comments and Ambassador Hoff. First, I think we need to look at what Iran really wants in Syria from the perspective of the Syrian opposition, and quite broadly, actually, way beyond the opposition, even inside the regime's constituency, let's say. There is no reconcilable agenda on which we can work with Iran because of the sectarian nature of the presence on the ground and a sectarian agenda. The issue of fighting jihadis is a priority of the Syrian opposition, an absolute priority, for which actually the Syrian opposition is already fighting, has been the first to fight, and is continuing to fight. The best way of evicting Daesh, as well as Nusra, is to push backwards in the first place and then withdraw sectarian-based militias supported by Iran. I think the worst player who can fight jihadis is those militias. They are fueling jihadism. And our main request today is, can we have these militias withdraw, geographically pull away from the front lines so that we start having a context in which the moderates can fight the jihadis, but certainly not with these militias. So we have a real problem here, which in fact is the successful eviction of the jihadis is directly linked with the presence or the withdrawal of these Shia-led militias. That is a key aspect of the strategy of the moderate opposition. Now, on Ambassador Hoff's comments, the either or, it may not be the proposition. The either military intervention or some form of arrangement with Russia could be the two options. But if it's not an either or proposition, and if Moscow only understands and takes seriously American propositions, if there is military action on the ground, would that be what you see, a combination of military intervention necessarily leading to some form of discussion, serious discussion with Moscow?
I guess Fred's answer would be a yes, so he won't have the chance to answer you. I will give the floor to Hussein.
Basma, we need to be realistic about the Syrian opposition. The most powerful Syrian opposition on the ground is ISIS, who is holding 40% of Syrian land. And then is Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, which they have about 20%. The peaceful Syrian opposition like you and like every other opposition here, their strength and power and influence is really compared to the power and the strength of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. You cannot really compare it, because most of the Syrian peaceful oppositions, they are outside in such a conferences, and they are there. Therefore, when we say opposition, we have to distinct the opposition. One, my personal belief, we discussed already together, is that the peaceful, respectful opposition, like all Syrian friends we have here, they need to come to cooperate with Assad government to keep their security and military establishment from a total collapse, to fight ISIS, to clean Syria from terrorism. 50–60% of your land is at the hand of terrorists. And then to cooperate for a peaceful election and let to Syrian nation to decide about the future, the next president, the constitution, and bring this United Nations Security Council to supervise and to support this process. Otherwise, the peaceful Syrian opposition is in weak position, practically on the ground. And Assad with military and security is one side, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they are on the other side. This is the reality of Syria on the ground. This is my personal understanding. I think you need to go, you cannot fight ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Assad, security establishment. You cannot fight all of them. You fight more, you would lose more land. This is the result of what you have been doing during since 2011. You have been more weakened, your country in more problem, and the terrorists with more funds, with more weapons, with more land, your government in less strength, weaker and weaker and weaker, and is not far from a total, I mean, Syria is not far from a total collapse.
Okay, this is a narrative or a perception. Just to maybe clarify what Basma was trying to say, you were talking about the peaceful civilian external-based opposition, but she was mentioning, I think, the huge number of FSA fighters who are neither Qaeda nor Nusra nor ISIS nor etc., and who are fighting effectively what you are saying it is impossible to fight, namely both the regime, its backers, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the others, and doing it effectively on the ground. So just a factual correction. I have 5 minutes left, and if you want to have more than one question, please be very brief, and on the panel, be very brief. So there were, yes, sir, sorry.
Thank you. I'll be very brief.
Please.
I'm Philip Walker. I work with a stabilization project based in Gaziantep, funded by a consortium of Western governments. And I'd like to return to the subject of the U.S.-Turkish dynamic. U.S. and Turkey have not been on the same page for some time now, and that has undermined efforts both of stabilization of North Syria and also to push back ISIS. So my question is, what tangible steps could be taken to get Turkey and the United States back on the same page? Thank you.
Who would like to take this question? Talib, please. But please be brief, because...
well, as I mentioned in my speech, I think the major focus of the U.S. policy after the Raqqa will be stabilization. And Turkey is already undertaking the stabilization politics in the Euphrates Shield area. But the turn in this issue, as we have just spoken, is a PYD. I think the maximalists, we can go beyond these maximalist demands, both of the US and Turkey. And what I said, that the third option is creating some kind of conditionality that will alleviate some kind of concerns of Turkey, and that will provide the ground for cooperation. Because in the end, practically, if Turkey wants opposition or the one Syrian opposition to have any kind of the future, this stabilization politics that will US be implementing and that is Turkey already implementing is very essential. So in this regard, there is a point of conversion. But the number one issue, I think, now is to address the question of PYD. It doesn't have to be between eradication and putting all the basket within the basket of the SDP. I think the conditionality of the military aid and reconstruction aid, and also making sure the PYD, like pushing it for the good behavior, is essential. Unfortunately, US hasn't done it. Like the very simple fact that right now the Syrian Kurds, the armed Syrian Kurds, who is also willing to fight ISIS, cannot come to Syria, and the US, despite all its alliance with the PYD, cannot, provide the foundation, cannot provide the passage for these forces to come to Syria, shows that US has not actually tried in a serious manner.
Something to add on that? Okay.
Go ahead.
The last question will be.
Sir, I'm former Congressman Flanagan, and I want to talk about the Russian-American dynamic here, which is fascinating for more Americans than almost anything else that could be happening here. The Russians have reached out enormously to the United States in various diplomatic efforts at low and high level to try and gain the attention of the Trump administration, particularly on Syria. I work with some of those groups which you referred to as the secondary or tertiary groups, and that's what they are at the Valde Conference and the current discussions in Florida that are going on. You're to be congratulated. Really amazing event to have the Russians reaching out to the United States to try and do something in Syria. I offer very quickly that perhaps my question is very quickly, what do Ambassador Hoff and you, sir, see as a future of co-equal Russian-American cooperation in Syria as almost godfathers or godmothers, as the case may be, of the country ensuring its borders and its future?
Well, thank you for your question, but I'm afraid I need to join Yuri in answering it. Unfortunately, the Russians so far, they do not have a clear actually vision and strategy of what the end game should be. It will largely depend on how the developments on the ground will go, on how the regional players will be playing, and how what the US perspectives on cooperating with Russia will be. So far, I would say, given the current realities, I won't see these cooperation going beyond deconfliction and, let's say, occasional cooperations in the areas like Manbij, where, because of different reasons, both sides appear to be interested in certain interaction. But what would be probably the preferred situation for Moscow, it is definitely the launching of the political process, and this political process is important again to give answers to the old questions that Moscow and the US were asking each other on during the previous administration, but still failed to reach them, like the terrorist grouping, like how to put pressure on the Assad and how to engage the regional players as well. So far, I would say that Moscow is just waiting what the US formula will be. So from this point of view, to a certain extent, the ball is on your side.
Talib, you wanted to add a very quick...
Very small addition. I think one of the trouble is that US thus far has asked its allies, and particularly in the context of Turkey, in operational, it has conveyed its vision for certain operation. It has never conveyed its vision for Syria, a political vision. I think that's the US not conveying a political vision for Syria, or at least, for instance, like in post-Raqqa operation vision, creates so many suspicion and so many unhappiness between the US and its allies. So one of the first steps, I think, for the US and Turkey dynamic will be the US conveying a political vision, what it wants the Syria to go from now and from here. And for instance, the first step will be, what is actually the US political vision once the ISIS is liberated? Because the concern in Turkey is that, well, will US let the regime take it? Will US let the SDP take it? Or, what is going to be in place? So you are asking your allies to join an operation in which you don't convey them a clear political vision that they can associate or dissociate from.
So much. One of the best way to make enemies is to be the moderator of a panel. I apologize from all the people whom I couldn't take the questions from, but some of you who raised your hands will be panelists in the subsequent panels. So please don't hesitate to put the remarks or the question, to answer the questions you wanted to ask during your panel. We could have gone on and on. This is an endless subject, but I think we have to stop there. I would really like you to join me and thanks our very, very fantastic panel. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.